One thing you're going to hear thrown around a lot when you're getting into JavaScript is people are going to say JavaScript functions are first class citizens. First class citizens. What does that even mean? Well, what it means is that JavaScript functions are values in themselves. They can be stored in variables and they can be passed in to other functions. So what's a value in JavaScript? Well, a value in JavaScript is like age equals 100, right? The value is 100, or const cool is equal to true. These are values that are numbers or objects or strings or booleans. And the cool thing about JavaScript is that functions can be passed into other functions. Functions can be stored in variables. Functions can be handled and moved around just like any other piece of data in JavaScript. And that's not true for every other language. And it's pretty neat. And it actually allows us to do some pretty nifty things with JavaScript. So we're going to delve into passing functions into other functions in the future. But for now, let's talk about the ability to put functions into variables. And this video is going to dive into all of the different ways to declare functions. So let's talk about that now. Let's make a new file in our custom functions folder. We'll make a new file. Let's call it ways to make a function.js. And let's console log. It works. And let's go back into that index.html and we'll just change the CF to ways to make a function.js. Open that sucker up in the browser and we'll check that it works. It does work. Good. The one way that we know how to declare a function right now is with the function keyword. So we say function doctorize, and we take in a first name and we'll return doctor first name. Now let's see how we can actually declare that in other ways. We'll comment that out because we're going to be redoing this function in all of the different ways. The next way is what's called an anonymous function. A function without a name is called an anonymous function. So if we actually just take this function right here and duplicate it. So if I go ahead and remove the name from this function, doctorize, that actually gives us what's called an anonymous function. A function without a name is an anonymous function. And it's actually not valid JavaScript in this case right here. It says function statements require a function name. However, they are valid in very many other use cases, which we're going to go into this video, specifically using them as callbacks. We'll learn about that, as well as using them in an IIFE, an immediately invoked function expression. But you'll see right here, just defining this function statement here, it's actually not valid JavaScript. So why would you ever want that? Well, that gets us to the next sort of way to define a function. Maybe we'll just say a non-function here, and we'll comment that out. Let's duplicate it and then comment out the first one. And then the next one is called a function expression. And a function expression is where you store a function as a value in a variable. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say const doctorize. And what we just did there is we took an anonymous function and we stuck it into a variable. And now if we refresh our page here, you'll see that we actually have doctorize available to us, and it will run just like we normally were, Dr. Wes. So that's pretty cool. And this is what people mean when they say functions are first-class citizens, because what we're doing here is we're actually just creating a variable like we're going to store a number or a string or a Boolean, except we're storing as a value the actual function name. Now, you may sometimes run across developers and they'll say, don't use that, it gives you bad errors. And what they mean by that is if you have like an error inside of here and you say like doesn't exist, you try to call a function that doesn't exist, and we go ahead and try to run that, what you see is this uncaught reference error doesn't exist is not defined. And those errors used to be really tricky to be able to find out where did this specifically happen. Obviously, it tells you the line number, which is helpful, but it actually used to not tell. It used to just tell you that this happened in an anonymous function, and you'd be sitting there saying, Thanks for the good info as to what happened here. I have no idea where this function is actually going awry. But in our case, it does now tell you that it happened inside of Doctorize on line 12. So while this function is technically an anonymous function, a function without a name, the browsers will now sort of infer the name of the function from the variable name, and sort of use that in the errors here as the function name. So it still tells you it's an anonymous function, but it also is going to tell you that it happened in our Doctorize function. So this is a way to define a function inside of a variable. It's called a function expression. So what's the difference between doing this, a regular function declaration, and this, our function expression declaration? Why would you want to do one over the other? Well, there's only one real difference past this error handling, which isn't really much of an issue anymore. The other difference is how they operate in something called hoisting, not hosting, hoisting. We're going to cover this topic in a future video, but essentially, I'll just, you know what, I'll show you real quick. Don't tell anybody I'm showing you this here. So let's say we've got this function Doctorize2 and we have regular Doctorize. If I go up to the top here and I run these things before Doctorize and I say Doctorize Wes, do you think that this is going to run? Like, if you run a function before you define it, does it work? Oh, let's see. Uncaught reference error, cannot access Doctorize before initialization. Okay. What about Doctorize2? Is that going to work? It seems to, well, I guess we have to console.log the output to see if it will work. Hey, it does work. So Doctorize2 works. Doctorize gives me an error. Why? Well, that's because even though these are the exact same functions that we've created here, because you define a regular function with a function keyword, and this one with a variable, functions that are declared with the function keyword are called hoisted, meaning that JavaScript takes all functions and hoists them up, and it says, okay, you're a function. I'm going to actually put you at the top of the file so that anywhere that you call the function, it will then be available to you. JavaScript does not hoist variable functions. It does hoist the declaration of the variable. We'll go into that. That's a little bit in the weeds, but it does not do it with this type of function. So why is that useful? Very rarely do I actually ever use. I'm going to go as far to say as I never use that in my entire career. There are some like little use cases that some developers like to have. I'll go into that at a later point. But that's really, you have to know. Hoisting is more of one of these sort of like interview questions that someone's going to sling at you. And essentially it means that JavaScript will take functions and bring them up to the before they're called. And you can technically run a function before it's defined with that ability. So that's why, that's how it works. So let's go back to what we have here. I'm going to bring this back to just regular Doctorize. So that is the function expression. It's a way that we can, that's the one we want to keep, not this one. This is the function expression, and you can put a function in a variable. So let's go on to the next type, which is called an arrow function. Now, arrow functions themselves have, I don't know, like 3 or 4 different like nuanced ways to declare them. So let's sit tight and figure out how we can do them. Arrow functions are an addition to JavaScript in the last couple of years. They offer a couple things. First, they offer a concise syntax. They're shorter. So if you've got a lot of functions or you have these little, what are called callback functions, we'll go into that. It's often handy to just write a quick little one-liner function. So that's one benefit. The other benefit that they have is that they don't have their own scope and referred to the this keyword. So we haven't gone into the this keyword yet, but we will in a future video, and I'll show you exactly the difference between a regular function like this or even this and a arrow function and how it scopes the keyword this. First thing, arrow functions are anonymous functions. So what it means is that there's no way to declare an arrow function like this. You always have to declare it and stick it into a variable if that's what you need. So to illustrate this, let's start writing a regular function. So we'll have a function, and let's call it inch to cm. So I know a lot of y'all are from America and you give inches. So what we want to do is have a function that takes in inches, and it's going to return centimeters. So we'll say const cm is equal to the inches times 2.54. And then we will return the cm from this function. Let's go ahead and try it out. Inches to cm. So if I've got 3 inches, we have 7.62 centimeters. Okay, that works. That's a regular old function that we have. Now, this is pretty simple. It's a pretty simple function, but it still takes up like 1, 2, 3, 4 lines of code. And you might think like all we're doing here is multiplying a number by 2.54. Why do we need such a big function in order to do that? So we can make that a little bit shorter by, instead of like creating a variable and then just returning that variable, you can actually just return the calculation itself. So you see, actually, look what happened there. My editor made that sort of a darker shade of what it used to be. And if you hover over top of it, it says unreachable code detected. That's because anytime, like we talked about, anytime you have a return inside of a function, anything after that is unreachable. It will never run, because as soon as a return happens in a function, that function is kaput. It's done. It's done running, and any code below that will never run. So obviously we'll get rid of that. So that's one way to make our function a little bit smaller, where instead of making a variable and then returning that variable, we can just return the output of this multiplication in one single line. Good. Now we can actually convert that to an anonymous function in preparation for the arrow. So instead of making a function with inches to cm, let's make it an anonymous function, and we'll say const inches to cm equals a function that takes in inches. So that's exactly the same, right? Let's just make sure it still works. Good. It still works exactly the same way. We've just made it an anonymous function and stored it in a variable. Now what we can do is we want to convert this sucker over to what's called an arrow function with a little bit more concise syntax. Now there's a couple steps in making, or a couple different ways we can make a arrow function. I'm going to step you through that right now. So the first thing is, instead of writing this is a big word. Instead of writing this big word called function, we'll delete it, and we'll go to the right of the parentheses and give ourselves what's called a fat arrow. So in programming, we call this a fat arrow, meaning that this is a skinny arrow, this is a fat arrow. So it's the fat one is with the equals and an angle bracket. So you have that there. I haven't saved yet. I'm worried that my prettier is actually going to remove these parentheses. If I save, yeah, you see it just put it on one line. I'm trying to teach you the steps here, but prettier is just doing all the steps for me. So I'm going to disable that. ESLint disabled. That didn't disable. There we go. Okay. I just disabled ESLint there, so it wouldn't actually fix it for me. So I'm trying to teach it to you. So there's the first thing that we did, is we took the word function and we removed it, and then we went to the other side of the parenthesis and put an arrow there. So the space could be like that if you like. And you see it still works, but my prettier will put spaces in between just for readability. Okay, that works. Does it still work? Good. It still works just as planned. So it's a little bit more concise. The next thing we can do is what's called an implicit return. Typing the return keyword right here, that's an explicit return, meaning that we explicitly return this value here. And an implicit return is returning it without actually having to type this keyword, right? Remember I said arrow functions are all about being concise. So they allow us to actually return a value without having to type the keyword return. So the way that works is, let's first put it all on one line. Functions can go on one line, we usually don't, just for readability's sake. So that's here. Let me put this all on one line there. Good. And then what we want to do to get rid of the explicit return is, first you delete the curly brackets, you put it all in one line, delete the curly brackets, and then delete the keyword return. And obviously there's one more semicolon there. We'll get rid of that as well. So what we just did there is we made a function called inches to cm. We set it to, this is the arrow function still right here. It takes in one argument, which is called inches. And then it will return. And the way we can tell this is an implicit return is because first it's all on one line. And second, there's no return keyword. So, and third, there's no curly brackets. So inches times, let's see if it still works. Still works just great for us. So what we did there is we removed the function block because often your functions are just going to be quick little one-liners that it's unnecessary to have the block. You totally can have the block. Like I could bring this back here and I could give myself the block curly brackets and I could still make my CM and then I could return the CM value. But then we're back to 4 lines again. So what's easier is we can first just return inches to CM, get rid of that. Then we can put it all on one line. Then we can get rid of the block of the function. So remove that, and then finally we can get rid of the return function that we have there. Finally, and this is more of a stylistic choice, but if there is only ever one argument for your function, you can actually get rid of these parentheses as well. Now this is a bit of a thing to look at. So let's just see if that works here. Yeah, it still works. Now, what happened here is that this is still your arrow function here, but we've taken the parentheses off because if there is only ever one argument to your arrow function, you can actually remove them. No problem. So let's do another example because I know that was a whole bunch. And often people can sort of like look at arrow functions and say like, what's going on there? There's a whole lot that's unsaid. And I prefer the actual functions that are a little bit more explicit. So let's make a function called add, and we'll set it to A and B, and we'll set B to 3 by default. And we'll say const total is equal to A plus B, and we will return the total. So what's going on here? We declared a regular function called add, which takes in 2 parameters. First one A, second one B. We've set it to a default value of 3 in B. Then we make a temporary variable called total, we add the 2 together, and we return the total at the end of the day. So pause, you try to convert the sucker to an arrow function yourself, and then come back and we'll do it together. Welcome back. Hopefully you had a great time. So let's first, we'll see if it works. Add, I don't know, 1 and 2. It works. Beautiful. Does it work if we just pass 1? You see that like DevTools here is actually giving you this little annotation here. That little question mark in front of B is telling us that the B argument is optional. That's pretty cool, actually. Why is it optional? Because if we don't pass it, it will fall back to 3. So if I just add 1, it returns 4 because B falls back to 3. So let's convert this. Maybe I'll just duplicate it. And then I'll comment this one out just so we don't have a duplicate. So first thing we want to do is let's stick it in a variable called add, and we'll remove the name of the function. Let's see, does it still work? Good. Next thing we'll do is we'll convert it to an arrow. So get rid of the function keyword, and we'll go to the right of the parentheses and give ourselves a fat arrow. Next thing we'll do is we'll just return A and B and get rid of that total variable. And the next thing we'll do is we'll put it on its own line. Get rid of that parenthesis. It's not necessary in that case. Then we can get rid of the function block and the return keyword. And we have a very short arrow function. The one thing you'll notice that we didn't do in this case is we did not get rid of the parentheses because look at that. Is that going to work? Malformed arrow function in the parameter list. So that's not allowed. And the reason why is that if you have more than one parameter in your function, then you must give yourselves the parentheses. So that is arrow functions. There's a couple other sort of gotchas that we need to know about. Let's go over them right now. There is returning an object. So let's make a function called make a baby. And we will take in the baby's first name and last name. And in here, we'll say const baby is equal to, and we'll have an object. And we'll say the baby's first name, or we'll just say the baby's name is equal to first, last, and the baby's age is 0. They were just born. So that's our make a baby function. Let's see if it works. Make a baby, kit, boss. I just had my baby a couple days ago. Returns undefined. Oh, we didn't return the baby. Always return your baby, folks. Ah, beautiful. So you pass in 2 arguments. It returns the name and the age of 0. Good. So how would we convert this sucker to an object? Well, we'll duplicate that. Comment this one out just so we can reference what it used to look like. First thing we'll do is we'll stick it in a variable, const, make a baby. Should we make sure it still works? Good. Next thing we're going to do is convert it to an arrow. So we'll get rid of that. Good. And by the way, if your function needs to do some stuff inside of the block, you can leave it at this. This is a perfectly valid arrow function. If the only thing you're doing is just using the arrow, both for the ability to type less, as well as some of the benefits of not scoping this we'll go into at a later video, this is totally valid. You can absolutely just stop here, and that's a great function. You should be proud of that function. However, we can take it a little bit further. So we could, instead of making a baby variable and returning the baby, we could just return this right here. Let's make a baby still work. Good. So now the question is like, how would I do the implicit return? So we can put this on its own line. Objects can be put on one line, no problem. That's a pretty common thing to do if you just want to make it a quick little one-liner. That still works. But how would I return it? Let's try. Let's get rid of the return. Oh wait, let's put it all on one line first. All right, this is getting a bit hairy. What's going on here? So then if we want to make it an implicit return, we get rid of the curly bracket and the return and get rid of that. But what's happened here? If you unexpected token that, it's what's happening here is that it thinks that the curly bracket from making the baby object is actually the curly bracket from the block of the function, right? Because curly brackets in JavaScript can be creation of an object, or they can be a block of code, which in this case, it's the block of the function, the body of the function. So how do you implicitly return an object when it gets confused about what the curly bracket actually is? And if that's the case, if you're implicitly returning an object, you just pop a set of parentheses around the thing that you are returning, and that will sort of contain it inside of a parenthesis, and it won't think that it's actually the block of the function. Then we can put a semicolon on the end there for good measure, and the baby still works. So is that a better function than the one we built right here? I don't think so. Probably not. You're not really having all that much benefit. I think that this is probably a little bit more readable. So there's sort of this, when arrow functions came out, and people sort of thought everything must be an arrow function because it's new and it's better. And of course it has a couple benefits, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing a regular function, especially you want to think about your future self. If you come back in 6 months and you want to know what does make a baby do, like what's a little bit easier? This is probably a bit easier to read than something like this. So don't always just go for an arrow function by default. And I think it will become a little bit more clear as to when you should reach for an arrow function in the future, especially once we get into working with arrays and doing map and reduce and filter and things like that. So that is arrow functions. We'll be going over those. We'll be using them a whole lot more over the next little bit. Let me get rid of this make a baby right here. The next sort of like way to define a function is called an IIFE, I-I-F-E. And this is an immediately invoked function expression. This is the IIFE. And the way that it works is if we create a function that is an, SVG component transfer function element, no, function, and let's just return, you are cool. And let's just console log running the anon function. So this is just a regular anonymous function. If we try to refresh it, it doesn't work because it's not allowed. And we talked about you can put these in a variable if you want, right? You can stick those in a variable and everything will be okay. But another way to sort of run these functions is what's called an immediately invoked functional expression. So what you can do is you can wrap this function in a parenthesis. And what that will do is parentheses always run first in JavaScript. And what this will do is it will return a function value. And then you can immediately run that function by putting parentheses on the end. Whoa! If we refresh the page, you'll see that our function expression was immediately invoked. It was immediately run. So immediately run function expression would be another way to say it. So like, what's the benefit of doing something like that? Well, it used to be very popular before we had modules and before we actually had what's called block scope. Because when we get into scoping, you're going to realize that a function declares its own scope, and it's often handy to even declare functions inside of this thing, and it will sort of provide us our own little sheltered space where variables can't leak inside and something like that. So I'm not going to go super deep into that just yet because I think it's a bit more of a advanced topic and we will be using it. But for now, we're going to just know that this is an immediately invoked function expression. Last thing is like, what if this function took an age? You are cool and age. Put backticks. How would that work? Well, if you want to pass an age, you pass it like that. So this will probably look a little bit funky to you. And again, it's probably not something you're going to be using all of that often. But it does come up every now and then where I need to create what's called a closure. We've got a video coming up on those. I need to have my own scope. So stay tuned for that. Next type of function that we have is called let's get rid of this console log. The next one we have is called methods. Methods. I've been sort of like just like saying methods and functions are the same thing. And we have an entire video on creating your own methods coming up. But for now, we can understand what a method is. So a method is simply a function that lives inside of an object. So if we take a look at our function here, which is console.log, and I say, hey, I've been telling you that console log is a function, and I've been lying to you. Log is actually the function that lives inside of console. Console is actually an object. If you just type in console and you open it up, you'll see that there's all kinds of stuff in here, right? If you hover over, where's log? Let's look for it. Here we go, log. If you hover over top of it, you see there's a little F there, and that means that it's actually a function. So log is the function, info is the function, console.count is the function, and console is an object. And we use a special word to describe functions that live inside of an object, and we call those methods. So we can actually do something like this, where we say const Wes is equal to an object, and we can say the name is Wes Boss, and we'll say hi is equal to a function. And inside of that, we can say console.log, hey, Wes, or we could return, hey, Wes. Let's try it. So we got Wes, and Wes.sayHi is a method. So that's one way to declare a method. You just create a property on your object, and you set it to a function. These functions can also have names. Sometimes you'll see this. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to do this, but it's technically allowed. The property or the variable is called sayHi, and the function name is also called sayHi. It's not necessary to do that anymore because the browsers will infer the name of the function from the property name. Just like when we stuck a function into a variable, there's no need to name it because it will infer the name of the function from the variable that it's in. So that's one way to define a function. There is also a new shorthand method. So we'll just say, we'll put a comment here, method. And then we'll just say shorthand method. we'll make one called yell hi. And from that, we'll just console log, hey, Wes. And you'll see what I did there is instead of saying yell hi colon function, which will work. Let's try it. Wes.yell hi. We can actually get rid of the function keyword and get rid of the parenthesis. And what this will do is it will make a property called yell hi set to a function called yell hi. So this is just a shorthand way to write methods inside of an object where you just write yell hi parentheses and then the function block. It's exact same thing as doing this. Yell hi is equal to a function that is console logging Wes. What something I goofed up there. What did I spelled function wrong. There we go. So again, we'll bring that back. There also is another way of an arrow function where we could say whisper hi, and that will be equal to an arrow function. We just console log, hi, Wes, I'm a mouse. Do mouses whisper? I think they do. So that's just another way. This is an arrow function that takes no arguments. In this case, you could take in somebody's name or something like that if you want. And that shows us. So these are 3 different ways to do methods. I would say this is going to be the most common way. The only reason you would do an arrow function is because you don't want to access this. We're going to go into that once we hit object, but I'll show you real quick in here is if you were to console log this, the keyword this inside of a method, if I were to console log wes.sayhi, you'll see that line 50, I console log this. So that's this one right here. And you open it up. This is going to be equal to the object that it was called against. And that's kind of cool because you could actually just do something like this. Console log, hey, this dot name. Again, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but I just want to show you real quick. So if I say hi, it says, hey, Wes Boss. If I change my name to Westopher, you see that it automatically just pulls it from the actual object itself. The thing about that will work in this one as well. It will not work in this one because arrow functions do not have a scope of this, or sorry, they take the parent scope of this. So again, a little bit ahead. We'll go much more into that in the future. That is what methods are. The final thing I want to talk to you about functions and ways to declare them, they are called callback functions. So let's make a callback functions. So a callback function is just a regular function, but we sort of use that name for something that will happen when something is done. And the easiest way to define a callback function is either when somebody clicks something, run this, or when this amount of time has passed, run this. So let's look at both of those examples right now. So first one, let's do a click callback. We'll go into our index.html and we'll give ourselves a button and say click me and give that a class of click me. Then I'll go down here and we'll select that element. We'll go much more into the DOM, but in order to select the element, we'll say const button is equal to document.query selector, say .click me, and console log the button. Let's see if that works. Good, we've got this button showing up. Then we're going to listen for a click on that button. We'll say button dot add event listener. And when that click happens, we pass it reference to any function that we want to run. So let's say wes.yellhi. So let's say wes.yellhi. Now, every time you click it, it just says, hey, Wes, right? So what's happening here is this is an event listener that we're listening for a click on, and the callback is sort of a function that we give it access to. You'll notice that we're not running it here. We're just saying, here's a function, the browser. Could you be a dear and call that function when somebody clicks that button? And that is what is referred to as a callback function. Now, callback functions can be declared outside of the handler. So it'll make a function called handle click. You can call that anything you want, and console log. Great clicking. In here, we'll say handle click. So what we've done here is we've defined a function called handle click, and then we said when somebody clicks it, here's a function that you should run, browser. And you click it, it says great clicking. The other option, and this is probably about half as common. I'd say myself, half the time I do it like this, where I define the function outside, and then I just pass in reference to the function. The other way to do it is you can actually just pass it an anonymous function in here. So we can actually do this. We'll just say function. And inside of that, we can console log, nice job. And it works just fine. So what we've done here is we've just passed it an anonymous function as a value directly, and the browser will know to call this function itself. So there's some upsides and downsides to doing it this way. We'll get into it when we hit event listeners, but just know that this is what's referred to as a callback function, a function that gets passed into another function, and then it is called by the browser at a later point in time. And the other example that we have there is like a timer callback. So in the browser, we have a couple ways to do timers, and we'll look at all of those in the future. And probably the simplest one is with a set timeout. And a set timeout takes two things. First, it takes a function to call that you want to run after a certain amount of time. So we could say wes.yell hi. And then second, it asks for a duration in milliseconds. So after how long should I run this? So let's do 1,000. That's 1 second later. Now we run this page, and after 1 second, it will run hey Wes. So that's cool, but you can also, like we've done before, is you can pass it an anonymous function. And in here, console log, done, time to eat. Bung, time to eat. So this is what is referred to as a callback function. You can pass those as arrow functions as well. That will work just exactly the same. Beautiful in any of the other ways that we've looked at it. So callback functions, we're going to use those a lot in our examples. So that is all the different ways that you can declare a function. We've got a couple more things to learn before we can get into writing a whole bunch of cool examples.